members of the Board of Appeals, I would ask the rest of you stay on mute. If you, 'cause this is meant for the members of the Board of Appeals. If you have something that you feel compelled to add or question, then I guess you can go to the chat at the bottom of the screen, raise your hand, something. I'll be on the lookout for it, or Jesse, if you would keep an eye on it. But I think that's how we ought to at least start. Okay, I think, James, we now, oh, there you are. Okay. So I'm in essence going to sort of turn this over to you, and you can kind of lay out how we might want to proceed.
I'm ready when you are.
Okay, great. Okay, so I just want to verify that all members of the board do now have a copy of the site plan review ordinance. Okay, great. All right, I have a question that I'd like, I don't know if it's a short answer or it'll kick us off. I have gone through it. I won't say with a fine tooth comb, but I've certainly gone through it. Is there anywhere in this site plan review ordinance that refers back in any way to the land use ordinance? I see no intersection in it so far.
Before we get to that, Madam Chair, I think I'd like to say something preliminarily.
Okay,
I know you intended to say, but forgot to say. Just that, of course, we're here for a workshop only. And we're not going to discuss any specific appeals. Get ourselves in trouble. All right, good. With that understanding, not that I know of.
so then I would like to ask Jesse, since you're mentioned at least as frequently as we are in this ordinance, have you any precedent, any past practice where this ordinance and the land use ordinance have had to work together, or where they did not? And what
Going back, looking at the last several, this ordinance was adopted, the site plan review ordinance was adopted May 14th, 2019. That was before I got here. It appears with reviewing the ordinance, the applications that were reviewed in 2019 and then this year, they've all been reviewed the same way by the planning board. They've received the application, they've gone through the site plan review ordinance criteria, and they have made references to the land use ordinance in all of those applications and findings. So they've reviewed them all the same way they reviewed this one, it appears, in reviewing the ones that I have taken a look at since this issue came up.
Okay, and have you in any of those situations found a conflict or any kind of argument between the ordinances?
As far as the ordinances disagreeing with each other?
Yes.
No, the only minor one we came up with was there was a difference in parking for parking requirements for schools. I believe one of them had it at 3 spaces per classroom, and one was 11 or something like that.
And how did that resolve?
The board is considering changes to the ordinance for the upcoming meeting to make them the same, either adjusting up or down.
Okay, thank you.
Madam Chair, if I could get in on
Yes.
that point.
Yes, sir.
It says specifically that in the land use ordinance in Article 1C, administration under D as in dog, inconsistency. If inconsistency between the land use ordinance and other ordinances, the more restrictive controls.
Okay, thank you. And that's in the land use ordinance.
That's in the land use ordinance.
Okay. Okay. That's all I had for the moment. I turn it over to other members of the board.
I have a few items if I could.
Please, go ahead.
I wanted to say a few things to the board. The first thing is that if you look at the purpose in each of the two ordinances, I found it fascinating this morning in reading the purpose of each one. So you can see that they're clearly separate ideas. They're going down two different tracks. And I don't know if it's the way I went to university or my other education from my brother who's a bishop, but I always like to look at something and what is it that it is? What's its nature, its essence? And then looking at the purpose, you see that the purpose of the site plan review ordinance is bigger things, commercial in nature, campgrounds. Whereas the land use ordinance is most everything else, and sometimes talks about those items as well. But reading the purpose, you'll see that they're different. The second point is in regard to applicability, going along with purpose. In the site plan review ordinance, under the Article 2 applicability, it clearly states the following matters, it's applicable to the following matters. And then if you read under the land use ordinance, Article 4, under the table of uses, and then under Article 8, permit applicability, it talks about what's applicable there. And so while it's not the case of never the twain shall meet, it is the case that there are two sets of things to review. And then lastly, the last point I have is that in the land use ordinance, Article 8, it does say that any permit required by this ordinance shall be in addition to other permits required by other law or ordinances. So I see the two, despite Dan Pileggi's eloquent encouraging us to read the two of them together, I see the two of them as separate matters. I don't think that should be the case going forward. I think the selectmen, the land planning board, I don't know how you do all your stuff there. I guess you rely on the code enforcement officer and then go through the planning board as usual routine. But I think there's a lot of discussion to be had to what the idea was with this and to making it, what's the word I'm looking for? Cohesive and synchronistic. That's what I'm looking for, synchronistic. So I would think that it would all be in the land use ordinance, just like we have in Bar Harbor. And I know I was once told in Fremont, don't ever mention Bar Harbor, but they have site plan review. In Bar Harbor, they have minor and major, but it's part of the land use ordinance. And what the land use ordinance says is you go through and do the following things and get a permit. Now, if it's a big mess, you also have to go through site plan review. And that's basically the site plan is how you review the application is what it is. It's not intended to be separate criteria as much as it's a gloss or an overlay on top of a regular application. It makes sense, right? If you think about it, for example, with a subdivision review, if you came in for a house permit, you would have certain things that the code enforcement officer would want to see. God knows that's complicated enough. More complicated Mount Desert and Bar Harbor because they have a code, building code. But then if you're going to do subdivision, you're going to have a lot more, especially submission standards. And then you go through and it tells you how to review it. And in regard to subdivisions, as you probably know, there's, I think some of you have been on the planning board before, there's a pre-application workshop, there's the completeness, then there's the initial thing, and then you go and sign it. So it's like a 4 or 5 stage thing. Well, site plan review ordinance would help you with the procedure and submission standards and all kinds of things. But I think it should be integrated within your land use ordinance. Now it isn't. So I think you have 2 review processes. That's what all I have.
So picking up on that, Jesse, the ones that you looked at in the short time that this ordinance has been around, were the reviews for those requests done under, were they done twice, once under site plan review and once under land use?
No, they were only done under site plan.
They were only done under site plan, and you said that occasionally it referenced the land use.
Correct. They'd referenced land use in their findings, such as they did in areas of this one.
So James, if the, past practice has been that whatever comes before us, we apply the site plan review ordinance to, basically what Jesse just said, wouldn't it just be the one review? We don't have a precedent to do a review under both ordinances.
Well, I think that, you're never too old to learn new tricks. Not that you're an old dog, but I certainly am. And you should have been doing it probably.
Should
So,
what?
You should have been doing it, and now you know better. So I think the planning board, if they would look at something, if you look at something, you would take it in and you would say to yourself, I guess Jesse would guide them. In most towns, code enforcement officer is seen as an unofficial guide, and would say, what ordinance does this go under? And then Jesse does a great job of having a memo to the board. And I think the gatekeeper, if you will, sometimes it's the planning board chair, but often it's code enforcement officer of the planning board meetings, sets the agenda and stuff, is code enforcement officer who would say, this is an application under. And I think going forward, Jesse should hand people an application for the site plan review ordinance or under the land use ordinance. And they can always go and ask the planning board separately to be put on the agenda under one or the other, but I think it's better to go through Jesse as to what they do. And then I think it's incumbent upon the powers that be over there, whether it's the selectmen or the planning board, to get the thing fixed fast as possible.
So Jesse, in the matter before us, and we're not going to discuss it, but I just need to know procedurally, in your opinion, did the planning board review it under both ordinances?
I think that's a mistake.
To answer that question?
Yeah,
Okay,
I don't think that's fair.
okay.
We don't
Well-
want Mr. Bear or Mr. Pelagi, I think Mr. Bear is listening in, but we don't want them to say that we discussed that application.
I have a question, but if the appeal itself references the reasons, and in a case in which both land use ordinance and site plan were cited by the planning board, don't we have a responsibility to look at both?
Well, the answer to that is real simple. Without talking about this application, which I adamantly refuse to do because I'm going to try to keep us on the straight and narrow, give Mr. Bear or Mr. Pelagi fewer reasons on appeal. I think in a situation such as that, if it came up, hypothetically speaking, then you would look at the appeal as under the ordinance under which it was reviewed. And in as much as the board, in its infinite wisdom or lack thereof, reviewed it under some other ordinance, you'd ignore that. So for example, if it came under the site plan review ordinance and they did a review under the site plan review ordinance and they had a checklist for that, for example, and then there was something else about the Exxon Valdez and Alaska and the oil spills, well, you would just ignore that as same as the land use ordinance. It's irrelevant. So do you see, Mike? I think that's.
Well, I do, but in a decision by the planning board, if they specifically were to cite that there is a violation of the land use ordinance and provisions of the site plan, wouldn't that imply that they reviewed it under both?
It
And
might,
have
but
objections
that's,
under both?
yeah, it might, but that's what they call, I don't want to get too in the weeds here, but in law school, we call that jurisdiction strictu sensu. or jurisdiction in the strict and narrow sense. So strictly and narrowly, the planning board lost its jurisdiction when it started to go afield. I guess I used to say off the reservation, but that's probably politically incorrect now. When they went somewhere beyond where they should have gone. As I said, it's just as relevant if they started discussing Exxon Valdez and oil mitigation standards as it is the land use ordinance. It's not applicable.
Okay, I do have some questions and maybe I'm out of line here, but some of them are questions about the land use ordinance itself and what it says. And
Sure.
it's not specific to this case. They're general questions.
Yeah, if the chair will allow, I'm ready.
Okay, all right. And again, I'm pretty sure I'm right, and I just want confirmation of most of them, hopefully. The land use ordinance says that a property which would have been non-conforming within the land use ordinance, but was in existence at the time the land use ordinance was adopted, it was grandfathered and could continue in that use, that after that date, they would not be allowed to do that. Is that accurate? Okay,
Generally, yeah.
okay.
I wouldn't put it that way, but
And that non-conforming use can be maintained legally as long as they don't make the use more non-conforming, and two, that the non-conforming use is maintained over time. In other words, it's not abandoned.
yeah,
Okay, and if they abandon a non-conforming use that was grandfathered for a period of more than, I believe it's 1 year,
depends
It
on the
can't-
town and the ordinance, but
yeah, it can't be restarted.
that's generally true as well, yeah.
Okay, and now it comes into, and this is where my ignorance really will shine. I have a difficult time reading both the site plan review and the land use ordinance, in that I find not all of it as clear as perhaps I would like, and I guess are there situations in which an ordinance might be ambiguous and becomes then a judgment call on the part of the planning board?
Practically, yes. Lawfully, probably you should avoid that.
Okay.
The ordinance, like all ordinances, are supposed to be looked at and applied by a planning board. They apply the standards. So the nexus and the interpretation of strictly speaking, that the planning board is supposed to do is the standards are supposed to be clear, and then they apply them. Does apply, doesn't apply, meets the standard, does not meet the standard.
And
In
but
pretty rare cases, I mean, right on the margins, interpretation the planning board could do, but generally speaking, you guys interpret the ordinance. You're the lawmakers, not the
Okay.
planning.
I will finish in just a minute, Joanne, I promise.
Oh,
Uh,
take all the time you want, Mike.
No, I'm going to try to roll back on that one just a little bit, because you touched on it, James, when you talked about, looking at site plan review ordinance and the purposes for it. And there's a purpose statement in the land use ordinance as well. And I guess I'm asking a question: are those purposes reasonable filters through which to look at applications and decisions?
Sure.
Does it meet the purpose as stated in the ordinance itself?
No, that's not how you ask it.
Okay, how
What
do
you're
I
supposed
ask?
to be doing is you're supposed to be saying, if you're at the planning board or a code enforcement officer, if they're doing the review, does it meet the standard? And the purpose is just it's not ethereal, but it is in the air, and it's supposed to guide you as to what you're doing. But you're in dangerous territory, some people try to do this, especially lawyers arguing for or against an application. The purpose tells me that this standard should be read this way. It's more general than that.
One last question, and then I will quit. I want to make certain that in an appeals process, is it the responsibility of the appellant to prove to the appeals board that an error was made?
That is fuzzy. I mean, in theory, yes. The appellant has the burden of what my former partner Chad Smith used to call the burden of going forward. They have to make the case. But the practical reality is that once it gets in the hands of the Board of Appeals, and there are matters on appeal or issues on appeal, the board's going to take them up and investigate and make a decision. So it's not exactly the same as the planning board where the applicant has the burden to prove everything.
All right. Thank you for your forbearance. I appreciate it.
No trouble at all. But I want to go back to if the chair will allow me, I'd like to go back to your comments on nonconformity. I do want to say in regard to nonconformity, and this is a little off topic, but I don't want anyone to get the impression that nonconformity is a standard that allows you to have stuff like a right. That's not how you should see it. Nonconformities are always exceptions to the rule to be beaten out whenever you can get rid of them. So they're an exception for which you're supposed to say, if I can find a reason to get rid of it, I'm going to get rid of it. That's the standard. They're like a variance. A variance should be no, unless there's a reason you should do it otherwise. Well, a nonconformity, what I would call a lawfully pre-existing nonconformity, is an exception. They're an abhorrence to good zoning. And they're supposed to be gotten rid of. And they're allowed or suffered to stay in place if certain conditions are met. So the way you presented it, I just didn't like it. It seemed to be the opposite of how it's supposed to be. They're not a right. They're an exception which is allowed or suffered to stay in place as long as it meets the following criteria, some of which you mentioned. So it's a real emphasis thing.
No, I read it the way you did it. I obviously
Okay.
didn't state it very well. Thank you.
Can I ask a question of James?
Yes, go ahead, Sandy.
I'm a little confused by what you said in the beginning about the site plan review ordinance and the land use ordinance. It seemed to me, and maybe I heard you wrong, that you were saying that a project that falls under the site plan review ordinance only get reviewed according to that ordinance?
No. It could be under both.
But we would need to, or the planning board would need to basically have two separate applications and review the application against both ordinances.
Unfortunately, yes, and I think that's up to the code enforcement officer to straighten that out and get them down the right path. So I think they would go, the system should be, for now, until we get it changed, they go in and see Jesse. Jesse says, boy, I think this is a site plan review ordinance matter. Or I think this is a land use ordinance matter. Here's the application form. Or Jesse might say, you better get a permit under both. So I think that's probably what should happen going forward.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Mel.
I was looking to see what would tie the two ordinances together. And under the Article 8 that Mr. Collier mentioned, I have on page 61 of 87, Section B, subsection 2, item Q. It states that the
Which ordinance, Mel? Sorry, which ordinance?
land use ordinance,
Okay, thank you.
under site plan development requirements, it says that the planning board must approve the site plan. I'll read, any person with a right, title, or interest in a parcel of land must obtain site plan approval from the planning board. And what criteria would the planning board use for site plan approval other than the site plan ordinance?
Good question, Mel. Are you-
Yeah.
I was just gonna say,
Usual.
what'd you say, James? Sorry.
I think Mel is correct as per usual.
And Mel, are you suggesting that maybe the site plan review ordinance was an outgrowth of that?
It was my understanding that it was an addendum to give the planning board a criteria which to make their decisions on.
So Mel,
That's the link. Go ahead, James.
Mel, then maybe you can find or have found something that I asked Jesse about, I couldn't find, which is something that says, and you use the site plan review ordinance to do said review. Does it say that? No? Did you find that?
Mel, did you hear James' question?
You asking me a question?
Yes, I'm wondering whether you found anything that said that that you go ahead and use the site plan review ordinance to do the site plan review.
Well, I guess it was sort of obvious to me, if the ordinance says that they have to approve a site plan, that they'd use the site plan ordinance, and in their refusal on their dated 9/29, they mentioned specifically items in that site plan ordinance that was not met, and that's why they denied the permit.
Yeah, we're not going to talk about that appeal.
Oh, I was not specifically to this one, James, wouldn't want to do that. Just saying that the planning board quoted in their reasons, the site plan review ordinance. So obviously they were directed to do that by this site plan requirements. I mean, it made sense to me. I don't see them as separate because it mentions it in the land use ordinance. Maybe I'm wrong. What do you think?
Mel, that wording specifically under Article 8 of the land use ordinance, what page is that? Page 59?
I'm on page 61 of 87.
Thank you. 61, okay. Site plan development requirements.
Correct. First two sentences.
Good eye.
I didn't find it. I spent half the morning looking for it.
Mill's semi-retired. He has nothing else to do.
And plus, he's a lot smarter than I am. He always has been.
So, James, let me now ask you, given the tie, which sounds like we can say with some surety that there is a tie, we would be reviewing anything of this nature once.
Well, it's still confusing to me. And let me explain why it's confusing to me. That although it's obvious to Mel, if you're not as smart as Mel or liberal in your thinking, maybe it's not as obvious to you that you then go to the site plan review ordinance. And to be fair to an applicant, I think what it should say is, and you go to the site plan review ordinance which tells you how to do the site plan review. So that should be there. Secondly, there's a problem with the standards that I don't understand and don't see language in regard to, again, you could, following Mel's thinking, and I think this is exactly what Dan Pelleggi was talking about at the meeting that we're not going to discuss. But there is a way that the board could say, well, there's case law that says you read the two of them together and make them work together. And so if you want to go down that road, you would have to then answer the question of, what do you do with the land use standards which aren't in the site plan review? And does the site plan review incorporate the land use ordinance standards? And I think that's a problem. And a reason it's a problem, unless there's another surprise that Mel's going to tell me about, and I hope that he does, is there should be something that says in around page 61 or 62, and while doing site plan review, you're going to use all the standards of the land use ordinance. And the reason I don't think that that happened is if you look at the checklist for the site plan review ordinance, it doesn't go through all the standards of the land use ordinance.
Just as a point of information, in both the land use ordinance and the site plan ordinance, under the applicability part, I'm trying to look at two different things here, and I apologize. The wording that they use is identical. In the site plan review, it restates a person who has a right, title, or interest. Then it goes on, subsection 1, construction or placement of any new buildings or structure. And then 2, the expansion of existing non-residential structure. And then it kicks into some things which my guess is aren't necessarily covered by the land use ordinance, but would be covered under a site plan. They talk about expansion of uses and add additions and things like that. So, I mean, there's even a tie back, not just to one referencing the other, but one uses the exact language of the other in that area.
But it seems like the intent of the site plan review ordinance in general is to take up commercial activities and bigger stuff.
I would guess that the language that we're looking at on that page 61 predates the adoption of the site plan review ordinance.
Yeah.
I think that might create an issue in you're saying that the two link each other.
Well, could be, but I think this is why I think the safest thing to do, despite Mel's good idea of using common sense and assuming, I think the safest thing to do, because you always want to be as fair as possible to the applicant, that the applicant was shown the path, right? So the ideal would be it's clear to all applicants exactly what's going to happen. You're going to go down this path with these 37 steps, or this path with these 17 steps. And so I think the fairest to the applicant is to assume that that's the case, Andy, and just to say, we're going to do 2, not 1.
I would concur with that.
And the real thing that persuades me of that is there is no integration clause. And your postulating makes sense to me because there's no integration clause. Because there's no clause integrating the two. So if the land use ordinance section was written ahead of time, then the site plan review ordinance came in. At that time, the land use ordinance should have been amended to integrate the site plan review ordinance. And it was not. Which is the reason, by the way, when I say about ordinances in general, I said to Jesse on the phone, I was talking to him earlier on the phone, I don't know who was involved there. I know I wasn't, but you should always have a lawyer involved in something like this. a very difficult ordinance drafting. And secondly, someone talked earlier about them it being hard to understand. Legislative drafting is a skill that's, you know, Philadelphia lawyers and angels. I mean, it's extremely hard to draft something. So there's two approaches, which is to get the most perfect thing in the world and work really hard at it and, you know, have a blue ribbon commission and study it for 20 years. That's one approach, and do the best thing ever and then only make minor tweaks. Another approach is to take a uniform law, which I think started with the standard shoreline zoning, and change it from the uniform thing and use that, which is basically what I've always tried to do. And a third approach is to write whatever you want and just keep changing it all the time, which is sort of the approach in Mount Desert. So in Mount Desert, they just keep changing, they change it twice a year. I don't like that approach because it's really difficult for the people to keep up with. But I think no matter which approach you choose for legislative drafting, one of the things you should do is when you have a significant piece of legislation which affects a lot of people, like the site plan review ordinance, someone should have been tasked off to say, does this implicate any other ordinance? And if so, let's put an integration clause into all those other ordinances and integrate all of them. And I don't think that was done. And, you know, tomorrow's a new day. We can fix it.
Yeah, I think that's good advice but we're dealing with what, we can't deal with that. That would be ideal. So what you're suggesting, I just want to reiterate that until that is fixed, we should review anything that comes before us under the site plan review ordinance and under the land use ordinance.
Yes, and I'm persuaded by Mel's pointing that section out. I mean, I didn't see that, and I'm interested in that, but I think Sandy's got a point too. I think that was ahead of time without there being a site plan review ordinance in place. So I'll give you a second, Mike. Let me finish.
Well, I just want to ask is in a situation like this, would not the land use ordinance be considered a superior document in as much as if a use is prohibited, it doesn't matter what your site plan looks like? If
Yeah,
the
that's
use
true.
use is not permitted, you know, and you know, it just seems to me that that's the superior document, that would gate anything else that would happen. If the use of the land were in conformance with the land use ordinance, step 2 is, okay, let's look at the specific plans for this use and how that matches the site plan requirement.
I think yes and no is the answer. The
That's
first
my
one
story
is
of my whole life, man.
no, it's not a superior ordinance. They all work together. So that's the first answer. The one's not superior to the other. Secondly, though, if it doesn't, you have to be legal under all ordinances. So you can't ignore the land use ordinance. But thirdly, I think, and more importantly, you're only reviewing it under one at a time. Let me tell you how that applies. For example, if you were looking at a quarry, and Ed's listening in, so I won't mention the one in Mount Desert, but if you were doing a quarry and you had other standards that weren't applicable, but were applicable under the DEP standards, you wouldn't look at them and you wouldn't say the DEP standards have to be met in order to approve this. Obviously they would, but you might say something in general like, as a condition of approval, the DEP standards must all be met before this goes ahead. But you're not going to review them. See what I mean? Because they're not your standards. They're someone else's jurisdiction. So here, in the strict and narrow sense, when you're narrowly focusing on the application in front of you, the jurisdiction of the planning board is limited to the ordinance under which the application is submitted. And that was the site plan review ordinance. And therefore, despite what you're, in contradistinction to what you're saying, Mike, they should not look at the standards of the land use ordinance.
But they should have had a separate process whereby the applicant
Yeah.
applies for land use ordinance and then it gets reviewed.
Right. And I'll tell you what's tremendously confusing in regard to some applications like campgrounds is they're in both ordinances. And then, of course, as you know, and I think this might have been alluding to, is the land use ordinance has more well-known, more widely used, and there are a lot of standards that everybody's familiar with and would naturally apply. And while I wouldn't say the word superior, omnipresent might be a better way to do it. But
Okay. Any other questions for James? By the way, James, I gave you bad information early on. I thought you were on here twice. Forgetting your last name was Collier. There's another James with a similar last name that is not you. So you're not up here twice.
oh, I thought I was bigger and larger than life.
Oh, well, I'm sorry to burst that bubble, but so other questions for James, for Jesse? Hearing none, I think we have our work cut out for us in a couple of days. Yes, James.
I do want to say one thing if I haven't been specific, or reiterate if I already have. But the purpose of I think Jesse touched on this, of the site plan review ordinance is to look at the impact development-wise of bigger projects. So that's why it's different than the land use ordinance. Land use ordinance, they tend to be smaller projects and it's conceived of differently. And the standard is, in this zone, you can do this, which means there are these standards which go with that thing in that zone, and it tends to go together. Whereas a site plan is more how it fits into this, the larger effect. And it's sort of a bigger picture. And that's why you have a site plan review ordinance. I don't know if that's adequately come across, which is kind of fascinating when you look at the criteria that are in the site plan review ordinance, and as a board goes through them, they're looking at the bigger picture. And the real unfortunate thing of having to do two applications is the stuff that Mike was saying naturally occurs. The two of them naturally go together. If you're looking at any given criteria that's going to affect something on a bigger scale because it's a commercial development or a multi-family development, then you would naturally look at the standards in the land use ordinance. So I don't know if that was adequately brought up.
Well, let me ask a question related to that, sort of in an opposite way. If somebody wanted to just build a single family home, Jesse, would you ask them to do a site plan review
No.
application? Okay. So James, what you're saying, and I guess the way it's being applied, is the site plan review ordinance is used predominantly when it's a bigger project.
Yeah, and it says that, right? Bigger or commercial in Article 2. So you see, for example, in Article 2A, 4, gravel pits, cemeteries, golf courses, other non-structural, non-residential uses, conversion of existing non-residential use to another non-residential use. So it's commercial activities. And then if you go on the next page, construction of residential building containing 3 or more dwelling units. You get the idea. It's a bigger stuff.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting is that I haven't done this, but if you went through and looked at this really closely, I think what you're going to find is that there's too much stuff in here subject to site plan review. And if you did an analysis, which is beyond the scope of this workshop, but if you did an analysis, or maybe you tasked Jesse off to do it, I think what you're going to find is that the CEO issues permits for a bunch of stuff. Then there's site plan review ordinance for commercial and larger residential, multifamily. And there's very little the planning board's left to do under the land use ordinance, which is very unfortunate. So if you wanted to, you could get into the over bureaucraticness of Bar Harbor and do minor and major, but I don't think that's right either. I think that most of your stuff could have gone to the planning board under the land use ordinance. And site plan review, I think, should be strictly limited to big stuff, really big stuff. Walmart's, new McDonald's, 5-unit apartment building, you know, big, important stuff. Subdivisions, of course, all subdivisions, because they involve water and fire and a bunch of stuff. But I think you really, if you have time, you should sit and say, these are the big ticket items that we think should be under site plan review. As it is now, it captures everything. You want to build a corner store, you know, site plan review. Maybe that's what you want to do as a town. I don't know.
Well, that's for citizenry and
Yeah,
to
political,
work on.
political.
Okay, again, any last questions or concerns, comments from board members? James, Jesse? I found this actually quite helpful, James. And Mel, good catch. I know that there's a lot here. And we'll tackle it on Thursday. I think it's 5 or 5:30,
5.
5 o'clock. 5 o'clock Thursday, we will convene formally, and we will do our civic duty.
Motion to adjourn.
All right, motion accepted. Thank you. I'll see you Thursday. Okay, Happy New Year. See you Thursday.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.